Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast. I am Kristin Boyce, a licensed marriage and family therapist with a private practice, Pathways to Healing Counseling. Through conversations, education, strategies, and shared stories, we will be closing the chapter on all the thoughts, feelings, people, and circumstances that don't serve you anymore and open the door to possibilities and the real you. You won't want to miss an episode, so be sure to subscribe. Welcome to this week's Close the Chapter podcast. If this recording sounds a little bit different, I'm actually out of the country and recording this intro. So it's not using my crisp mic that I normally use for podcasting. So the rest of the episode is recorded with my regular microphone. The intro is not. So I'm just so grateful you're here with me, regardless of the microphone, that you are on this growth journey to healing and finding freedom in your life. And I hope each episode brings you something that expands you, opens you up, and helps you grow and evolve into being your most authentic self. And my guest today, this is actually an episode I recorded in 2023, and this is worth listening to multiple times. So if you've not listened to this episode, please listen to the whole thing in its entirety. If you struggle with shame, like we all do, of not feeling good enough, there was actually a shame story I had. That's been my reoccurring shame story if you've listened to the podcast, and I'm boring. And so that can pop up no matter where I go. I've done so much work around it and definitely have done so much healing around that shame story. And just so you know, shame stories can pop up when you least expect them. And what I've learned to do is offer myself self-compassion. I've learned to be so nurturing to that part of me that says you are worthy, you are good enough. You just being who you are and showing up and listening and showing someone you care and being attuned is enough. Just you being is enough. You don't have to do anything, but just show up and be. And this guest today really introduced me to what self-compassion means and how powerful it can be in your life. Dr. Kristin Neff, I met her back, I'm trying to think, I think it was back in 2012. It was a long time ago. It might have not been that far back, at a Brene Brown training that I was in, and she was the guest speaker. And she had just written her book on self-compassion and done the research around the impact it has on shame and how transformative it can be when shame comes up and you feel not good enough, you feel unworthy, you feel defective, you feel like there's something wrong with you, you feel whatever story you have going on about how you're not enough, how self-compassion helps you heal that shame when it does pop up, because it will throughout your life. So this encore episode is one that I hope makes a difference for you. You might need to listen to it 2 or 3 times, take notes, and just take in her sense of compassion into your heart, into your soul, and let it transform you. If you take nothing away from this episode, I hope you take away that you are worthy, that you are enough, that you are lovable just the way you are. And the fact that you're listening to this episode says so much about you. You are on this journey of discovering your most authentic self and being the best version of yourself. And there's no price tag you can put on that. So if you want to grab the journal that I give away for free, feel free to at Kristen, Kristen, Boyce, BOICE.com/free resources. And here is my conversation with Dr. Kristin Neff. Let it seep into your soul and heal those parts of you that are screaming to know that you matter. I'm so excited you're here for this week's Close the Chapter podcast. I am in awe that this guest is on the podcast. I first got introduced to her way back when I became Dr. Brene Brown trained, and we were introduced to self-compassion in Brene's books. And it was Dr. Kristin Neff's work, because she's a pioneer in self-compassion, that Dr. Brene Brown would talk about.
And then I heard her speak at one of the trainings I was at for the Daring Way. And I love her and her work. And she's on the podcast. I know, I'm getting so excited. I just cannot tell you how amazing this interview was. And I feel like a kid in a candy shop. Like, this is one of the guests that was on my kind of bucket list of guests. And she's on the podcast. You'll want to listen to this episode so many times because there's so much depth of information in this one podcast. So save it, bookmark it, send it to those people in your family, start integrating it in your life. It will change your family system, your parenting, your relationship with yourself, your trauma, the shame, the stories that you tell yourself. It's going to transform you to become more free, to speak up, be your authentic self, love yourself. Because we can say, oh, just love yourself, but a lot of us don't know how to do that when we talk about it on the podcast. So let me introduce you to Dr. Kristin Neff. She spells her with an I-N. I spell mine with an E-N. We talked about that when we first got on. And let me share the wealth of, I hate the word credentials, but her background with you. She is currently an associate professor of educational psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. She's a pioneer in the field of self-compassion research, conducting the first empirical studies on self-compassion more than 20 years ago. She has been recognized as one of the most influential researchers in psychological history worldwide. She is the author of best-selling book Self-Compassion, and her latest book is Fierce Self-Compassion: How Women Can Harness Kindness to Speak Up, Claim Their Power, and Thrive. Along with her colleague, Chris Germer, who's amazing as well. If you ever want to learn more about mindfulness and self-compassion, he is a pioneer also. She developed the empirically supported Mindful Self-Compassion program and founded the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion. They wrote the best-selling Mindful Self-Compassion workbook. You'll want to get her books. The first book I ever got was Self-Compassion. And then she wrote the mindfulness kind of workbook. Then she wrote the latest one on fierce compassion. And she shares she has a new book in the works. And she reveals that in the working title on this episode. We just had a deep dive into self-compassion. And I talked to her a lot about all of our negative thoughts that we have about ourselves, our shame and not feeling good enough and not loving ourselves. And then our children. Maybe it's your grandchildren, if you work with kids, and how they're really struggling to love themselves because of comparison in social media. So without further ado, so excited, here is my interview with Dr. Kristin Neff. Share, tag, post, let me know what you think. Here it is. Enjoy. I am beyond thrilled. This might be one of my most excited guests that I've ever had on the podcast. I've had many wonderful ones. I was introduced to her work back I became a Daring Way facilitator with Brene Brown years ago, 2012. And then my guest today, Dr. Kristin Neff, who really was a pioneer in self-compassion work. I saw her speak at a conference I was at and fell in love with the material, really went on a mission to integrate it into my own life. And then as a parent, really embraced how to offer myself self-compassion, nurture with tenderness my younger parts that really needed that in childhood, and how to integrate it now. And so it is my honor and privilege to have you with us, Dr. Neff. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Kristen, for having me on. I'm happy to be here.
We were just chatting about EN, Kristen with an EN and an IN. You get the IN or EN, I get the IN.
That's right.
Here we are. So thank you so much. I thought what we'd start with is, can you define self-compassion and the difference between self-compassion and fierce self-compassion to start with?
Yeah, well, so self-compassion is really, if you think of the Latin compassion as suffering comes with. So how are we with our suffering? Big suffering, little suffering, whether it comes from like we've made a mistake or we feel inadequate, or compassionate, supportive, warm, caring, friendly way, or are we with ourselves in a shaming, judging, cold way? And so the self-compassion is again, being kind to yourself, but it actually has two other elements that I like to talk about. One is mindfulness. In other words, we need to be willing to turn toward and acknowledge and be with our pain in order to give ourselves compassion. Normally, either we try to repress it or not face it, or we get sucked up by it. We kind of get lost in it. So we need a little perspective, like to step outside of ourselves and say, you're having a hard time. Can I help? So mindfulness is necessary and also really important. What makes it compassion and not pity is a sense of connectedness to other people. So self-pity is poor me. If I pity you, it's for you. Compassion is, hey, I've been there. Whereas self-compassion, it's, hey, life isn't perfect for everyone. So not in a comparative way, we don't say, is my suffering more or less, but there's nothing wrong with me for making mistakes or having challenges, and I'm not alone. So those three elements together make up self-compassion. And then there's also a fierce and a tender expression of self-compassion. So if you think of compassion as concern with the alleviation of suffering, which is actually kind of the standard psychological definition, well, sometimes I need to alleviate my suffering by accepting myself. If I'm just totally judgmental or if I'm a perfectionist, then accepting myself as I am. I'm also accepting my emotions, the fact that things are difficult, that instead of fighting them or ignoring them, just, okay, this is here. I'm right now. And then when we're tender with ourselves, it's almost like a mother with her child, crying child. We're there for ourselves. We care for ourselves. We soothe ourselves. And eventually we start to heal. Very important part of self-compassion. But sometimes we need to take action to alleviate our suffering. So if we're being complacent or like we're doing behaviors that are unhealthy or for situations that are unhealthy, it's not self-compassionate to accept those, then we need to take action. And so a really important part of self-compassion, for instance, is drawing boundaries, speaking up for yourself, saying, no, that's not okay, like protecting ourselves. That's like mama bear, the energy of mama bear, or else providing for our needs or motivating change. So it's really asking yourself, what do I need right now? And then the answer is going to differ depending on your situation.
I love this concept because I think a lot of people don't know where to start. They're like, I don't even like myself. So I've had a lot of clients say, I don't even like myself or even my inner child. I don't even like my little self. How do you begin to start offering yourself self-compassion and liking these parts, all these different parts of ourselves that we might have just disliked for so long?
Yeah, well, interestingly, liking yourself isn't necessarily part of the equation. That's more self-esteem. Do I judge myself positively or negatively? Compassion is an unconditional sense of worth. The moment a baby is born, they're worthy of compassion. You don't have to pass a test to be worthy of compassion. It's intrinsic to our humanity. That's why the sense of humanity is so important. There may be things that are good to work on. It doesn't mean that you're not okay just because some of your behaviors maybe could do a little work, or maybe you make a mistake. Well, just because you made a mistake doesn't mean that you are a mistake. Brene Brown likes to say that. It's really not necessarily about liking yourself. It's about understanding that you're doing the best you can. You're here, you're a human being, you feel, you're trying your best, you're struggling. In other words, self is in there, but we actually don't take ourselves that personally. In other words, so many causes and conditions went into who we are. Our upbringing, our genes, what we ate that day, our culture, our age, how we've been treated by others. Very little of it actually is under our direct control. Almost none of it, if you really want to be honest, is under our direct control. And so we have compassion for that. The fact that, here I am with the hands I've been dealt, just day by day, doing my best. We kind of open our heart to that. And also remembering that everyone's in the same boat. Everyone makes mistakes and is imperfect. Yes, of course, some people suffer more than others. I'm not going to deny that. Of course not. But every human being is worthy of this kind of approach, especially from ourselves. If not from ourselves, then who?
Yes. How do we begin to learn to offer ourselves compassion?
If you can't give yourself compassion, you can start by giving yourself compassion for the fact that it's hard to give yourself compassion. Kind of tune into the discomfort of having that hardened heart or all those feelings of judgment. And, what would you say to a friend who said, I can't stand myself, or I'm such a horrible person? Your heart would melt a little bit. No, that's not true. You're much more than that. You aren't just these behaviors or these patterns. Or, when you look in the mirror and you only see that one flaw, you don't see all the rest that's right. And so really, I think you just start there. It hurts to have my heart so closed. And can we acknowledge that, validate it with mindfulness, remember that we aren't alone, and be a little kind to ourselves? a little encouraging, a little gentle, or maybe a little mama bearish if we need it. But it's really about caring for whatever our experience is. And again, if you move away from myself as like a concrete individual separate from everyone else with a set of traits, and just the fact that I am awareness whose feelings, who's experiencing life, having things constantly change. And it's almost like you open up your heart to the experience of being, as opposed to judging yourself and your traits and your qualities and your successes and your failures. Some people might call it your higher self, if that works for you. If you aren't a spiritual person, you could think of it as maybe your care system that's inborn through evolution. We're all designed to actually be caring people as well as problem solvers. And so it's really just a mindset shift away from the question, do I like myself or not? Is it even relevant whether you like yourself or not? You're doing your best. And how can I care for myself? You might say, is this healthy or not? That's a valid question.
Yeah, I love what you just said, because I don't think I've heard anyone say it that way, that we're all designed to be caring. I mean, as humans, we don't think of the humanity as that way, I think, in a lot of ways.
We're also designed to be self-critical. So here's the thing. So if you are self-critical, don't beat yourself up for beating yourself up. There's a reason. First of all, our culture does not tell us to be self-compassionate. It tells us to be compassionate to others, but it's really suspicious of self-compassion. It's going to make you lazy or unmotivated. So you weren't taught it, but through evolution. So evolution designed us as human beings to be very threat sensitive, especially when it comes to personal threat. So if I make a mistake or something's challenging in my life, or I fail in some way, or something's painful, we go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. But of course, the problem is with us. So we fight ourselves. We attack ourselves as a way to stay safe. We think, well, if I'm really hard on myself, maybe I'll change and I'll be safe. Or maybe I'll beat others to the punch, so I'll hurt myself so it won't hurt so bad if others judge me. Or we flee into a sense of shame or isolation. Or we freeze and we get stuck and over and over, thinking we almost play dead, right? So these are natural behaviors that don't come online if your best friend fails or makes a mistake. You're also personally threatened. So you're actually able to use a second safety system, which we have, all human beings have it, which is the care system. So again, genes designed for this, systems of oxytocin and other opiates, designed to care mainly for our infants and our group members. Because if we did that, if we were caring, our genes would survive and pass on to next generations. But it's more natural for others, not so natural for ourselves. So we do have to do a little hack. You have to tap into the system that's designed for others, use it with ourselves. But the body doesn't know the difference. So if someone else, let's say, puts their hand on your shoulder, your cortisol is going to go down. If you put your hand on your own heart, cortisol goes down. So you can relate to yourself the way it feels more natural to relate to others. And you get the same benefits. If you want to think about what's the consequence of all this self-criticism, just think, what if you told your friend, I hate you, you're stupid, you're ugly, whatever it is, what a loser you are. What's that impact going to have? They wouldn't be your friend if you did that. But the same impact you have on yourself. Whereas if you say to your friend, by the way, if you're a good friend, you're going to be honest with them. Because if you say, oh yeah, your problem is not a problem if you do that, when in fact, they're really harming themselves, it's not a good friend. So a good friend gives you honest, clear, but constructive feedback. This isn't working so well. It might be helpful if you do this. Is there any way I can help you do that? That type of constructive, supportive stance is much more effective in helping us be safe and make change.
I like how you said that, because I do think, because your nervous system will spot, I find my nervous system will spot that inauthenticity.
Yes.
Will almost give me an answer in my body. I don't feel like that's genuine.
Authenticity. Because when the baseline is, okay, just because I'm a human being, I'm intrinsically worthy of kindness and care, then I don't have to try to impress others so much. I don't have to fake it to be acceptable. And so it gives you a lot more freedom to be your true self.
Yes.
Including with yourself, to be your true self with yourself. I know it sounds funny, but the more we know about part psychology, we have different parts of ourselves. So we have a part of us that's compassionate, a part of us that's critical, a young part, an older, wise part. So it's really how we're relating to these parts. That we should have called it self-compassion if it has to be totally accurate. But
I agree. I do think there's these different parts, because it's not an all or nothing. It's not like all of us, even though sometimes it feels like that.
Yeah,
it's part of us.
That's right. We become fused or blended with a particular part, and it kind of takes over the system.
Yeah. So it's a little internal family systems.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yes. let's jump into, because I know many listeners are parents or grandparents, or they're working with kids in some capacity. And what I'm gathering with working with teens and family systems, because that's my passion, I love family systems, I see so much self-criticism and this, I'm not good enough, so shame and comparison, and it is deep. It is deep. They get on the social media and immediately their body has a response.
It's horrible. We thought we had it bad, right?
Oh my gosh.
So much worse.
Yeah.
It's like even my son. So my son has autism, which maybe it changes a little bit, but he's actually very self-critical. He knows to be self-compassionate, but it's a natural response because when he feels threatened, it's like his first reaction is, I'm afraid someone's going to beat me up, or he sees these cartoons of the weirdos getting beaten up. So he's afraid, so he beats himself up first. It's kind of just so he could have some sense of control. And so it's a natural response. We shouldn't judge ourselves for it, but it's not very helpful. And so the thing with teens and with kids, first of all, it kind of makes sense. These are common sense ideas. If you ask a teenager, would you say this to your friend? Would that be very helpful? They probably say, no, actually, it wouldn't be very helpful. So I think they can get it logically. So in terms of practicing it, really just the more it's modeled and embodied by parents and caregivers, the better. Right? So you can't tell your teenager, you should really be more self-compassionate. That's one more thing I got to do. But so first of all, if we embody self-compassion, here's a really cool thing. We've got probably heard of interpersonal neurobiology, Dan Siegel's work. We just know a lot about empathy in the brain. And we actually read others' emotions at the pre-verbal level. It doesn't really matter so much what they're saying. Our brains are designed to pick up what other people are feeling. So if you're a parent, and maybe you don't criticize your kid, maybe you're pretty good about that, but you criticize yourself either out loud or even internally, then first of all, let's just talk about internally. Your mind state, your kid is picking up on. So if your mind state is frustrated and angry and shaming, then you're embodying that and your kid's picking up on that. But if your mindset is, well, I'm doing the best I can. I'm an imperfect human being. This is how we learn. To then be kind to myself. Then your kid's picking up on that with their mirror neurons. And then you add into that outward modeling. I mean, a lot of parents, you break your grandma's precious vase and oh, I'm such an idiot. And you're really saying that because you're hoping that the other person doesn't call you an idiot. Moment when you break grandma's precious vase and bottle self-compassion, you're like, oh, I love that vase. It was my favorite. Oh, it's so sad. Well, it happens. I'll try to be more careful next time, or if I should have, maybe put it somewhere different. You model, first of all, feeling compassion for your mistakes, acknowledging them and taking responsibility and doing something, but not beating yourself up for it. And then when you model that, there's actually research that shows we pick up what parents say. If they model self-criticism, we think, oh, that's a really good way to be. If they model self-compassion, we think, oh, that's a good way to be. You can't totally control it because so much of this is biological, but you can help. And so my son, well, he also has OCD in addition to autism. He's challenged that way. So we have little scripts. When his brain acts up, we say, tricky brain, I know you're trying to keep me safe, but it's actually not helping. I am worthy of kindness and care and support in this moment. Sometimes you need to say little things like that because, again, the brain's going to do its own thing. But it can be something that's learned. He's pretty good now. He'll put his hand on his heart and do everything. So
I love that. I like scripts. I like the idea of scripts. I was an example of this. We just got a new truck. My husband had gotten a new truck for his company car, and it had one of those steps that comes out automatically. I didn't know that. I'm I open the door, boom, the step comes out, hits me in the knee, in the shin. And I've got bags of groceries. And my daughter's with me at the time. She was younger. And I go, ouch. Oh, sweetie, you're going to be okay. And I'm talking to myself. I literally was you're okay, sweetheart. I know that hurt. It was an automatic response just came out of my mouth. And I just go, okay. And I set the groceries out. She goes, Mommy, you're talking to yourself so kindly. I said, that's how I heal when I get hurt. I feel better when and she goes, she's a teenager now. She has not forgotten that moment. She's remember when that, and it's those little moments.
Think how powerful that was. You probably course of her adolescence. It doesn't make everything go away, but it's a tool she has, a resource she has to fall back on.
And then now she'll go, Kate, it's okay. That's her name. She'll go, Kate, it's okay. And she'll talk to herself out loud. She'll go, you don't need to get worked up over this. It's all right. And she's internalizing a voice. And it, like you said, she still has comparison and shame and things like that. I'm now seeing the fruition of really doing my own work around it and how that's translated into parenting.
And the thing is, when shame arises, you can give compassion to that. It's like you start wherever you are, whatever's arising, if shame or self-criticism or fear of failure is arising, then you give compassion to that. You can give compassion to anything that's arising in the moment.
What are your biggest challenges with it as a person, as a human, just to humanize you? Like, what are your biggest challenges with self-compassion?
Yeah. So, I mean, it is pretty instinctual for me. But for instance, self-compassion is pretty instinctual, but do I make mistakes as often as ever? Absolutely. So reactive anger is kind of one of my things. It's just in my hardwiring. So what I love, I get really passionate, but sometimes I just get just too much of an edge.
Yes.
And then shame arises. Spiritual retreat. And I started like getting angry at my teacher and talking to people. I was like, here I am on a meditation retreat and it's still happening. Like shame arose and I just, so it still arises. It's not like it stops. But I could give compassion to myself for it. Instead of like buying into the story that I'm a horrible person and that I might as well give up now, it's like, well, you're an imperfect person. Things arise. We aren't in total control. And I could work with it. But sometimes I do have to remember, because again, I think internal family systems is a wonderful model. When a part takes over, we don't always have access to that self-compassionate part. Sometimes you have to remember it. But fortunately for me, it's fairly habitual. It won't take too long before I remember compassion. But it doesn't make the pain go away. It does make you stronger so that you can hold it more efficiently and more helpful, a lot more helpful.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it just goes to show, I mean, we're all humans, and those stories, like when we get hit with the shame, the stories, I'm like, oh, they think XYZ of me or whatever the story is.
Yeah.
That can be hard to take hold of. Like that story can become so big.
Especially because often there's some grain of truth in it, right? So there was one incident. Of course, we don't think about that 9 times out of 10 when we didn't, or actually probably 19 out of 20 where we didn't react that way. That doesn't form the story because we have this negativity bias, right? So it's just the 1 time out of 20 when we did act that way that becomes who I am, that defines who I am. We have very distorted thinking. Thought, really, the more I would have to say, the thing I can be more and more clear on is thought, although it's useful, is really a problem. It distorts things, doesn't see things clearly. We think things are permanent and darker and more horrible than they are. And it's just, we tell ourselves these stories to make sense of things, even if they aren't true. We don't care. We just want some storyline that's going to make us feel, I don't know. I think like if you look at a lot of our politics today, it's people telling themselves stories constantly. What if we could just drop out of it and just be? What's really happening? Oh, I see. The sun is shining. I'm alive. There's energy flowing in my body. I'm pretty healthy in this moment. And that's actually, anyway.
I think the stories can be a defense almost. Do you think that?
Well, yeah, because if you
try to protect us,
like systems is like a manager part.
Yes.
Our prefrontal cortex, right? It evolved to be a problem solver. So whenever we feel any sort of threat, we go into problem solving mode. And our stories, we kind of solve things in our minds, even if actually 9 times out of 10, or at least often, it makes things worse. It actually doesn't help. Many, many times it makes things worse. It doesn't help. Here's the interesting thing. Our underlying motive is usually always care. Because if we're trying to be safe, it's because we care about ourselves. So even people who are horribly self-critical, the reason they're horribly self-critical is some part of them thinks it's helping to keep them safe, which is a form of care.
I have not framed it in that way. I like that. It's a form of care, that you're trying to care for yourself, which is the protective part, trying to protect you from hurt, shame, blame, judgment, rejection, abandonment.
It is. It's just not very effective, but you kind of tap into its motive. When people say, I don't care about myself, well, actually, you kind of do. Otherwise, if you didn't self-criticize, you probably wouldn't care at all.
Yeah. You'd probably be pretty detached, too, would you say? Like not connected at all? Because that's a defense, too. Like, whatever.
Psychopaths, for instance, that's one of the issues. They just don't care about other people, about themselves. And that can just, you just kind of can have compassion for that. They didn't choose to have those brains, but people with brains like that, they just don't care. They don't self-criticize. They just kind of are detached from life. Yeah.
Which is like a survival state that they're stuck in some ways, would you say?
I'm not a clinical psychologist. I don't know enough to say, but I just know that there is a brain difference.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you wrote your first book, let's talk about the journey to your books, because you've got 3. I mean, you've got, if you're including the mindfulness workbook, would you include that in there? Okay.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay, so
four, but that's
4. Okay, tell me the 4 and then the evolution of how they evolved.
yeah. And then I'm also writing a 5th right now. Yeah, self-compassion for burnout, self-compassion toolkit for burnout. So the first book is Self-Compassion, and that's probably the best place to start for anyone who's interested in learning it. It's very personal, and it really lays out the basic concepts and a lot of stories. And then I created the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook, which came from my collaboration with Kirsten, who's a clinical psychologist, and we created a training program to teach people self-compassion. So it's basically the training program in workbook format, very practice-oriented. It's not so personal, it's a workbook. And then we created the Teaching the Mindful Self-Compassion program for professionals, which is more like a textbook, kind of the pedagogy of teaching self-compassion. But if you're a therapist, for instance, it can be very useful to think about, well, how do I teach this skill to others? And then last summer, a book called Fierce Self-Compassion came out. I actually wrote it for women. It's called Fierce Self-Compassion, how women can harness kindness to speak up, claim their power, and thrive. And I was kind of torn about whether I should write it for everyone or just for women, but it kind of was on the heels of the Me Too movement. I had my own kind of Me Too experience. And I realized, so gender role socialization stands in the way of being able to balance fierce and tender self-compassion. And I'm not talking gender identity, whether you're cisgendered or transgender or non-binary or whatever. It's just the box where you put it in a pink shoebox when you were little, where you put in a blue shoebox, right? So people put in the blue shoebox, they aren't allowed to be tender. They get bullied and often beaten up. So they aren't allowed to be sensitive, which really undermines this core emotional strength of being compassionate towards your emotions. It can be less accessible. Only 10 to 15% of the people that show up to my workshops, people identify as men because of that. So it's harmful. But then people put in the pink shoebox, they aren't allowed to be fierce. They can get called names, different names, if they're too fierce, or they're considered too ambitious, or people don't like women, or too uppity, or too loud, or too outgoing. Especially in anger, people do not like it when women are angry. An angry man, people believe him. Oh, he's passionate. An angry woman, oh, they don't believe her. She's crazy. And anger, it can be a problem, of course, if it's misplaced, but it has a function. It can focus you, suppress the fear response, and it has a role as long as it's aimed at alleviating suffering. And I think one of the things I noticed in my own kind of story in terms of this man was kind of abusing people sexually, one of those stories, the people weren't speaking up and had a hard time getting angry about it. And that's because it's been so socialized out of us. Oh, see the best in people, or, I don't want to say anything. I don't want to rock the boat. And that's partly not that women have, share any blame for it, but that's partly what allows it to continue is people aren't willing to speak up. Then, how are we ever going to stop the problem? And so that's really where that book came from. And so it talks about the history of patriarchy and, how it's not an accident that women's anger has been suppressed because we're a lot easier to control when we don't complain, aren't we? Or we don't get angry about things. So I had to write the book. And then the book I'm writing now, like I say, it's going to be called, we aren't sure of the exact title yet, but it's the Self-Compassion Toolkit for Burnout. More like the workbook, it's practice focused, but specifically how to deal with burnout is such a huge problem now in society.
Huge. So I love the evolution because it seems like your evolution too, like your journey.
Whatever. So all of it really comes from my own journey, my own personal life.
I love that because it seems like you feel more empowered. Like as you have kind of continued on the self-compassion journey, it has empowered you to find your voice, happen and be okay with feeling all your emotions, including anger. So that work really, can be for some people, like this is the work, like it empowers you to be more of yourself, find your voice, set you free. I find particularly women, but men too, that have been abused in some way. They are so afraid. It's almost like our bodies go into freeze, as we know, to protect ourselves.
Yeah.
And I really believe in your work that self-compassion can help you unfreeze.
Absolutely. It can help you unfreeze. It can help you get unstuck. Often what also fear freezes us, shame is a big one that gets us sticky. When we feel shame, such an uncomfortable emotion, we don't even realize we're feeling the shame. And if you look at things like depression or anxiety, usually there's some vein of shame in there. And self-compassion is actually the antidote to shame. So instead of feeling judgmental, isolated, and identified, I'm a bad person, we feel kindness, mindfulness, and a sense of connectedness to others. So it really unravels shame. That's another thing that research shows.
The shame is so powerful. I mean, it just takes you down the rabbit hole. And yet you feel like you want to hide.
We have compassion for our shame. We aren't alone. We're only human. This isn't all of us. It's just a part of us or just a behavior, and some kindness. And the moment you do that, shame starts to unravel.
Yes. How did you get partnered up with Chris? Because I'm always curious in the journey of how people like find each other on this journey of life. You guys were meant to find each other. How did that all happen?
So in 2008, there was the Mind and Life Institute, which is founded by actually the Dalai Lama and Richard Davidson and some other people, had the first silent meditation retreat for scientists. And so I signed up for it, and Chris Gerber, I didn't know at the time, signed up for it. And he contacted me and said, "Oh, Kristin, I love your work." It was near him in Boston. "Do you want to ride?" And he said, "Sure." And so we met. And yeah, it was meant to be. It's been, I like to say, it's my most functional adult male relationship. It's been a great
I can see that. I feel that with you too. You have that, you're modeling what it looks like to have healthy communication.
In writing this book, we butt heads sometimes, but we can work through it. It's okay. We can talk about it. Usually, whenever we butt heads about something, it always comes out better. Because he's got a good idea and I've got a good idea. And that's why resolving it leads to something better. So.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things I think people struggle with is communication. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to say it. They're afraid to speak up because they're going to hurt someone. Someone's going to get mad at them. Someone's going to get dysregulated. How does self-compassion help with communication and finding your voice?
One of the things, that's funny, my book, Fear Self-Compassion, in some ways with me, because I'm not afraid of what people think of me. And so that's why someone with reactive anger, so my thing is how to integrate the tenderness with it. But I will say there's strength in that. If you look at what I've accomplished, part of it's because I'm not afraid to put myself out there and I'm not afraid to speak up. And part of that is because I have self-compassion. So when you aren't afraid of people's judgments of you, because your bottom line is, I'm okay because I'm a human being and I'm imperfect. And it doesn't mean free reign to cause harm. Obviously I'm a very caring person. So it's something that an edge I'm constantly working with. But it absolutely, if you know that the bottom line is you're okay, and it's okay if other people don't like you, and that your worth is determined by whether or not people like you or think you're nice or whatever, gives you a lot of freedom.
Yes. I also see with couples, if maybe one person goes into anxiety, like that's their default, and then one person is bent towards shame, and the shame they might get angry.
The thing is, self-compassion is good for all of it because it's really just looking honestly at what's happening. That's the mindfulness. Remembering that you aren't alone. This is part of being human. There's nothing wrong with you for doing this. This is how humans work. It really helps. And then kindness and support. What do you need? What would help right now? And what you need can be different depending on your patterning, the way your brain works, your childhood history, your culture. You need to be kind to myself. It's going to look quite different. And giving yourself permission to say, what's true for me? Even asking the question is half the battle.
So where does someone begin with, what would be one mindfulness exercise that you think is probably the most important one you've taught over the years for someone to
be? So probably the easiest one is what we call the self-compassion break. Actually, they do it in research. If you want to know how to bake a self-compassion cookie, here are the ingredients. 1 part mindfulness. So in other words, be turned toward the fact that you're hurting. This hurts. Validate it. Look at it. Bring it into your awareness. I'm not alone. 1 part common humanity. Remember, there's nothing wrong with you. You aren't the only one. If you kind of think of all the millions of people in the world, probably going to do something similar. So letting go of that fake sense of isolation. When kindness can be just simply, what would I say to a good friend I cared about who's going through the exact same thing I'm going through? And usually much more experienced at being kind to others. So you usually know what to say. And then you make a U-turn and you say it with yourself. So if you can remember those 3 things.
I highly recommend your quiz to the self-compassion quiz.
Yeah, so I created a scale to measure it. You can go to my website, selfcompassion.org, and you can take it. I'll give you a score. And even just asking the questions can be really informative. Like, I never thought of that. What?
I often give it to my clients. I'm like, let's start with this. And then I love the exercise you just taught because you have lots of resources on your website. You are filled with so many resources. Give the audience that website for those that might want to.
You'll find me. I got it early on the Google algorithms. And so it's selfcompassion.org. But again, if you just type the word, it'll lead you straight to me. So yeah, I've got 20 free practices on there. We have like a 5-day self-compassion challenge you can sign up for. Got on my books. We've got some, and I'm actually going to be starting in a couple of months a self-compassion community, which will have like dialogue discussion boards and meetings with me. So that's kind of an exciting new project to get a little more of that. Sangha, his community, helps a lot when you try to practice it. The best way to practice is with others. So I'm launching that.
That's exciting. I think people are craving community of people that are doing the work together.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm excited for that. That'll be great. So if you're on your mailing list, then people can will find out about it.
Yeah, just join my mailing list. And I also send out a blog, a little video every month, usually with the practice.
Fantastic.
I try to give away stuff as possible.
You're very generous.
I really don't.
Very generous. And your books are filled with so many practical resources.
Yeah.
So it's one thing to have the theory, and it's another thing to say, okay, now how do I really implement this in my life?
Exactly.
And you have
to understand it.
Exactly. You have both, which I love. What are the top 3, would you say, most important concepts of self-compassion or fear self-compassion that you could share? Like just your top 3.
So one that I haven't discussed is called backdraft, which is an important concept because sometimes actually when we open up our hearts to ourselves, we think, oh, I'm going to feel so good. Actually, sometimes we feel bad. There's like backdraft. A house is on fire. If you open up the doors, the air goes in and the flames rush out. And so we think we're doing it wrong. We're actually doing it right because what's happening is we're opening up our hearts and all the pain that's been stored in there starts to come out. So it's not a problem just to realize it's normal, but it's a signal also that you may need to slow down a little bit if it's too overwhelming or destabilizing. You might need to just kind of titrate how much do you let in, how much do you open to, go more slowly, maybe get a therapist to help you through it. So that's an important concept. Another really important concept is call it the paradox. We give ourselves compassion not to feel better, but because we feel bad. In other words, self-compassion is not like we're sprinkling powdered sugar on everything to make ourselves feel better. Because if we do that, we aren't really accepting the fact that, yeah, we hurt. So we do it just because we hurt, fully accepting that we hurt. We don't do it as a self-improvement project, fully accepting that we're flawed human beings. And we're kind to ourselves because we're flawed human beings that hurt. Actually, often that we do are able to more just change. But if that agenda is that we don't accept ourselves or our emotions, it's not really self-compassion. So that's an important concept. And maybe just one last concept I like to say, it's really helpful to drop out of your head into your body. Because our head, the thoughts is where the storyline is of how bad I am, how bad my life is. Your body is just, first of all, it's always here. It's always right here, right now. And it's actually an important conduit for self-compassion because just physiologically, babies, we are born to respond to, for instance, soothing and supportive touch in a way that activates parasympathetic and nervous system, deactivates sympathetic response. So using your body, putting your hands on your heart or your face, or just try not to just think about it so much, but just feel it as a physical sensation. Use any sort of physical touch to ground you to stay compassion.
Those are really helpful. I wanted to just expand one moment on something you said. Do you think people can do bypassing? Because that was just somewhat what you were saying.
You can misuse anything. You can misuse the truth. You can misuse philosophy. You can misuse self-compassion or mindfulness. You can misuse spirituality. The human brain, we're funky monkeys. We can misuse anything. So it's always good to check in. Am I being self-compassionate, again, to do away with my difficult emotions or to be a better person? Well, then maybe you want to rethink. Or to be self-indulgent. So if you really care about yourself, you're not going to choose the easy way out. You're going to say, I need to work on this because that's caring. And if you just say, oh, it doesn't matter, I'm going to be self-compassionate, you aren't really being self-compassionate. You're, again, bypassing. You have to always be careful of that. And again, no matter if it's self-compassion or whatever it is you're looking at.
That's a very good point. How do you know if you're bypassing? What would be the tells if you're bypassing using
ask yourself that question. Am I doing this to feel better or am I doing it just because I feel bad? If there's a subtle agenda, then maybe you want to rethink it. Again, not that we don't do things. Yeah, of course, we do want to take action. But can we take action while fully acknowledging that right now things are imperfect? We'd be okay with that. And if you can't, then that's a good sign that you're bypassing.
So accepting the moment as it is, accepting the pain.
And accepting ourselves as we are.
The
my behaviors. Yeah, of course I want to help my behaviors. I want to be happy. But define who I am, and they don't define my worth. So we need to hold both together.
I think that's an important concept with burnout, too. Because if we spend a lot of energy trying to just feel better, then we're not really
exhausting ourselves.
We're exhausting ourselves. We're hustling in a way that we're like, oh, I'll just use self-compassion and then I'll feel better.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, instead of
really, then it's just powdered sugar,
which can exacerbate you feeling exhausted because I still don't feel good. Well, that's because you're trying so hard to put yourself in this good place
That's right.
or be this good person or whatever you're trying to shift intellectually versus embodying it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes. Well, is there anything else that we missed that you feel like is important to share?
Maybe just one last point is the number one block to self-compassion is people think will undermine their motivation because they don't understand fierce self-compassion. The research shows it's absolutely not true, that it shifts the reason trying to achieve because you'll be a better person or because you aren't acceptable. You try to achieve because it'll make you happy because you care about yourself. And that allows you to be more okay with failure, which allows you to learn from your failure because failure is our best teacher. And it actually helps improve your performance. And you can learn more and try to figure out, okay, well, what did work so well? How can I improve that? As opposed to I'm terrible and shaming yourself, which really is very helpful. So that's just a big one for people to keep.
I think that's a really important point. How did you get to the point where you didn't care what people thought? I mean, you care, but you're not like driven by what people think. I think this is a big one for people.
Well, the years of self-compassion practice, that's really one way it paid off as I got older. It's like, that's my bottom line. Of course, I want people to like me. It's not like I don't, but it's like, it's my worth. I know my worth is dependent on it. And that's freedom. That's one of the biggest things self-compassion has given me. It's been 25 years now of practice. So it's been some fruits.
I think that's the bottom line of what it offers you. The freedom of knowing and connecting and embodying your worth and value, like needing it externally. So if someone doesn't like you, no, that doesn't feel good. And you know, you're still okay.
That's right.
You're still lovable, and regardless of how the person responds
Well, especially because if I could love myself. And so it's like the source is internal as opposed to external.
And we just framed how to do that because people are like, just love yourself. And people are like, well, that'd be nice for some folks, right? They're like, I would if I could.
It has to be unconditional. It's like a parent with a child. Not all parents do love the kids unconditionally, but I think a lot of us do. And we understand that's probably the closest we get to unconditional love. And so we can learn how to do that with ourselves.
Thank you so much for sharing your heart, your loving energy, your wisdom, and your authenticity. And think you're showing us, this is the byproduct of you doing, like you studying this and doing this work and teaching others. Like you're showing us this is the freedom you find in self-compassion. So thank you so much. I encourage everybody to get the books and begin to integrate it into your life and just notice the differences. So thank you, Dr. Kristin Neff, for being here today.
Have a good day.
Thanks, you too. Thank you so much for listening to the Close the Chapter podcast. My hope is that you took home some actionable steps along with motivation, inspiration, and hope for making sustainable change in your life. If you enjoyed this episode, click the subscribe button to be sure to get the updated episodes every week and share with a friend or a family member. For more information about how to get connected, visit Kirsten, KRISTEN, Voice, VOICE.com. Thanks and have a great day.